Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Make that 170 members of the federal Liberal Party.
It's time to actually try to lead a country, to try to make it better, and not try to knock it down, not to continue to be negative.
That's former Conservative MP Chris d'Entremont speaking to reporters the morning after leaving the federal Conservative Party to cross the floor into the Liberal caucus. Now, it comes after Prime Minister Carney tabled his first budget, focused on investing big in Canada's future rather than focusing on the here and now, which d'Entremont says will cater to the priorities of his Nova Scotia riding of Acadianopolis. But the move doesn't leave Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre's leadership style out of question, nor does it sound like d'Entremont will be the only one to change the color of their professional wardrobe from blue to red. I'm Maria Kestane, and today on The Big Story, I'm talking to Glen McGregor, political correspondent for CityNews, to break down the broader implications for Poilievre's Conservatives following Tuesday's floor crossing and whether or not more quote-unquote red Tories could be following in his footsteps. Glen, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
You know, some big claims from d'Entremont following his rather bold move from the Conservative Party to the Liberals just hours after Prime Minister Carney tabled his first budget. Some of those being that he didn't feel represented by Poilievre, pointing towards his negative approach. What did you make of that switch, Glen?
I think you have to look at the context of this. Chris d'Entremont is certainly what you would call, as you described, a red Tory. That is, he's not a really strong Western-style Reform Party conservative. He is more of the Atlantic Canadian tradition that is much more closer sort of on the political spectrum to the center than, say, Mr. Poilievre would be, or any of the past leaders of the Conservative Party, including Andrew Scheer. So it's not a huge shock that if someone was going to go, it would be someone like Chris d'Entremont. He was the only Conservative MP elected in Nova Scotia back at the end of April. He had a long career as a progressive Conservative member of Nova Scotia's provincial legislature. So not surprising, really, that that's where he is on the spectrum. His comments, though, talking about his concerns about Mr. Poilievre's leadership, I'm thinking the written statement he put out yesterday, sometime after the budget came out, he referred to, looking to be more constructive in its opposition, and that he didn't want to be part of this sort of culture of complaint. That is kind of seems to be a sort of a reference to the fact that Poilievre in opposition, his style has been very much over the past, couple of years since he was chosen leader in 2022, that he's really kind of critical of the Liberal government, Trudeau first and now Carney, accusing them of sort of breaking the country, that everything is broken. This was actually lines that they would use in some of their political communication, was kind of assailing everything, that anything that went wrong in the country, in the economy, could be blamed on the federal government, even if it was things that were quite clearly out of the federal government's control. So that was kind of one of the things he considered. I think, and I didn't hear this from d'Entremont, but I know that there was a lot of Conservative MPs who were really concerned about those comments Poilievre made recently about the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the fact that he went on a podcast, sort of an independent media podcast, to do this, and he talked about how the RCMP failed, in his view, in their duty to charge former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau related to two different cases, the case involving the SNC-Lavalin affair and the fact that Trudeau was found by the Ethics Commissioner to kind of inappropriately put pressure on his then Justice Minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould, and then the other case in which Trudeau had taken a vacation on the island owned by the Aga Khan, the leader of Ismaili Muslims. Again, the Ethics Commissioner had found a breach of the federal ethics rules there, but not criminal charges, very different from something that's actually a crime. Poilievre felt, though, the RCMP should have investigated this more thoroughly. The RCMP did investigate and ultimately decided in both those cases there wasn't anything to support the grounds of criminal charges. But the fact that Poilievre went on and called the RCMP despicable over this, or at least the leadership of the RCMP despicable, I think really kind of unnerved a lot of conservatives, that those sort of more red Tory type conservatives, because they thought it was just kind of not constructive. It was attacking the police essentially, which the conservatives have always had a long history of kind of unalloyed support for. So that was kind of possibly a break point for him. Conservatives, though, pushing back sort of the other direction. You see a lot of online conservatives talking about this, both people who are in Parliament and also people who are just kind of supporters of Poilievre, alleging that d'Entremont did this really out of selfishness, that he was doing this for his own personal reasons, that he was also bitter about the fact that the party didn't get behind him earlier this year when we came up for a vote in the House of Commons to elect a new speaker and deputy speakers. D'Entremont had sought the speaker's job in the past and had failed, but he had been a deputy speaker of the House of Commons before, wanted to return to that role, and he didn't have the party support behind him. And I think that was possibly frustrating for him, but that's what his former colleagues now are blaming for this decision. Of course, only d'Entremont knows himself ultimately what this calculation came down to for him, his exact reasons for doing it. But it's caused a lot of hurt feelings in the Conservative Party right now, Maria.
Absolutely. I want to touch on those comments in the RCMP. And, broadly speaking, looking at Poilievre's return to Parliament 2.0 for Poilievre, I want to get your take on how he's doing in the eyes of his constituents in his party. He's kind of been going down a bit of a slippery slope there. And I want to know, do you think he's lost a bit of a grip on his party following his federal election loss earlier this year?
Possibly we're hearing more signs of dissension than we did before the election. But, keeping in mind, coming into this election campaign, he had a massive lead, 25 percentage point lead in the polls over then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Everything changed, of course, when Mark Carney was a chosen leader of the Liberals and led them into that campaign. So, yeah, I think, anytime you lose, you are going to have people questioning your leadership in the future. And this is, not just a matter of opinion. This is actual procedure within the Conservative Party that now, because a leader has lost a federal election, he or she must go through a leadership review process, and that will happen in January. Looks like Poilievre is probably going to make it out through that process okay. I think he's got enough support in the caucus and certainly within the broader membership of the party. People who are with him are really with him. And in terms of his kind of style, the thing about the RCMP was sort of a reflection of this sort of attack dog persona that he always brings. He's been a very effective opposition politician. This is something he's really good at. And I've covered him. I used to work for the newspaper here in Ottawa. So I covered him as a young MP going back to 2004. And he was like that from the beginning. I had people coming up to me on the street saying, "Do you know this guy Poilievre? He seems like kind of mean-spirited guy." And I said, well, I've met him a bunch of times at different political events, and he seems always very nice and personable. But this public image that he projects in the House of Commons and when he's out speaking publicly, sort of a different, much more aggressive tone. Has that really been tempered since the election? I don't see it, really. He still seems quite aggressive. There have been some changes that are sort of noticeable with journalists covering the Conservatives, because the Conservative MPs who were before the election were very inaccessible, hard to get to talk, not really all that friendly with journalists. That has changed. We see Conservative MPs now doing interviews. In fact, Poilievre himself did an interview this last weekend on the CBC, which previously they did not do. Conservatives just avoided it because they believe somehow the public broadcaster was not supportive of them politically, and so they just kind of froze them out. So that's changing now. You see Conservative MPs are more free to do those kinds of things. But I guess the big question, though, is now, as we head towards this leadership review in January, and then sort of the immediate crisis, if you could call it that, I'm not sure it is, but this immediate situation is whether or not there are others like Chris d'Entremont who also are having serious second thoughts about continuing to sit as a Conservative member of Parliament. And right now, it's just a case of one. We haven't heard, there's lots of rumors that there may be other MPs out there. I was at the post-budget party. So it's a tradition in Ottawa that whenever the new budget is released, there is always a big gathering where the finance, in fact, both the finance minister, François-Philippe Champagne, and the prime minister swing by it. So you have lots of lobbyists, lots of MPs, political staff all gather, lots of journalists there. And this, of course, was the main topic of conversation. Everybody talking about how many others are out there in the Conservative ranks who are prepared to follow Mr. d'Entremont's steps and leave caucus and either sit as an independent or join with the Liberals as a way of expressing frustration with the direction of the party under Poilievre. And so far, the answer seems to be there might be some out there, but we don't know who they are, and they're not speaking out. And, and now a full day has passed since this happened, and we've not seen any others come forward. Could that happen tomorrow or later in the week or, crucially, next week before the budget vote, which is on November 17th? Looks like the date is the House of Commons will ultimately vote whether to approve the budget. And of course, this is the numbers game for the Liberals. They need, now that they've got d'Entremont on side, they need 2 more votes. Any MPs on the opposition side. So we've got Elizabeth May. That's one potential vote. Could they convince her to come and vote in support of the budget? Then you have the Bloc Québécois, just pretty firmly said they're not going to support it. The Conservatives have all said they're not going to support it. At least those absent Chris d'Entremont, who we expect now that he's a member of the Liberal caucus, will vote in favor of it. And then there's the NDP, and they really could, decide this. But so in that time period, up until that vote on the 17th of November, we don't know how many more Conservatives will step forward. Very likely, there will be none. This could be just a one-off thing. And that's quite often how these floor crossings work. If you look at the recent history of Canadian politics, the floor crossings have usually been sort of just one and dones. There's not usually a huge exodus. There was a little bit under when Stockwell Day led the Canadian Alliance a party, that there was kind of a defection. You had this rump of MPs that were very unhappy with his leadership. They all left. And then, of course, they were brought back into the tent when Stephen Harper and Peter MacKay formed what is now today the Conservative Party.
You mentioned that Poilievre will come out okay from the convention in January. What kinds of conversations do you think will take place that week, that convention?
Well, I think by the time we get to the convention, it's not really going to be much of a mystery. The big speculation will be about what kind of approval number he gets. What kind of support does he need to show in that process, in that leadership review process, to kind of come back and say, all right, I went through this. I understand you were frustrated with the outcome of the election campaign. Maybe we could have done some things differently, but I still have X percentage of the party membership with me. So generally speaking, I think the figure is somewhere between 75 and 80% he will need to say, okay, the party is united behind me. I can continue on as leader. If it's lower or much lower, that's going to be a totally different situation. But I think just talking to folks about it, there does not seem to be an appetite for them to essentially depose Poilievre at this point, and largely because there is not an alternative. I mean, remember when the party did this the last time? That is right in the sort of the height of the Freedom Convoy back in 2022, the Conservatives tossed out their leader, Aaron O'Toole, who had just a few months earlier run an unsuccessful election campaign. He'd lost to Justin Trudeau. That had been, at that point, was the Conservatives' 3rd consecutive electoral loss. There was a lot of unhappiness, but there were people waiting in the wings, including, of course, Pierre Poilievre. So the caucus at that point decided to vote out. They used something called the Reform Act, which is this mechanism that the party voted to adopt after the election that would allow them to change leaders simply based on a vote of the MPs in the caucus. And that's what they did. And that's why Mr. Poilievre is leader today. But I don't see that there's any figure out there like that right now. Certainly no one within the Conservative caucus right now has kind of risen to the prominence, the level that would be required to people really start seriously getting behind them and pushing them as a potential leadership candidate in the way that they did with Mr. Poilievre 3 years ago. So I don't see that there's going to be a lot of pressure on a lot of drama about this in January. I think we're all going to be looking at what is the final number coming in at, and again, I think it's going to be in that 75 to 80% range, and that will be high enough to allow Poilievre to continue.
I want to touch on d'Entremont himself. You know, he was, as you said, a member of the Nova Scotia Progressive Conservatives in their House of Assembly since 2003. You know, we're talking about more than 20 years of backing a Conservative Party, all to come to an end just this past week. What do you think the final straw was in this current federal Conservative Party that ended a more than 20-year support for Conservatives?
Yeah, it's hard to really know what the trigger was. Like I say, those comments about the RCMP really concerned a lot of people in the party and in the caucus, and I presume he was one of them. Was there other personal reasons, like his frustration about not getting the deputy speaker gig? Or was it more that he saw kind of the overall direction of the party, and then he saw the budget coming out yesterday, went through the budget, read it over, and decided he could support it? That seems unlikely to me. I don't think the budget was necessarily the trigger for him to make this decision, because it would have been in the works for a little while. There's some rumblings right now that a lot of Liberals were talking to d'Entremont, especially Liberals from Nova Scotia. There's a lot of prominent Liberals down there. Cody Bloss, who's a Liberal MP for that area, he is very well trusted by Carney. And then you have, of course, Sean Fraser, who's now the Justice Minister, probably the best known MP right now from Nova Scotia. So they were very likely would know d'Entremont personally, and probably if there was any kind of some concerted campaign to reach out to him by Liberals on the back channel, very likely those two would have had an inkling of it, and possibly they could be looking, for the Liberals are still looking for other MPs who might be in a similar situation. Not in Nova Scotia anymore, because there are no more Conservatives MPs in Nova Scotia. But I think you're going to be looking at the Quebec caucus, Conservative caucus, as well as possibly even some Western seats in British Columbia, possibly Alberta, Saskatchewan, where there is some MPs have similar frustrations with the direction of the party. It's hard to really figure out what ultimately, in any of these floor crossing cases, what ultimately tips the balance for the member of Parliament. I mean, you look at things. Going back to some of the recent cases, Leona Alislev was a Toronto area a Liberal MP until she crossed the floor to join the Conservatives in 2018. She did not get elected in the 2021 election campaign, so she wasn't around. But then you had like more high-profile cases like Belinda Stronach, who is the heiress of the Stronach Magna Auto Parts empire, very prominent MP. And when she crossed the floor from the then Conservative Party to the Liberals, when Paul Martin was Prime Minister, she dumped her boyfriend Peter MacKay at the same time because he was a prominent Conservative MP from Nova Scotia. So sometimes there's like personal factors that play into this. And quite often there's always the suspicion that the party that has brought in the floor crosser, convinced them to defect and come over, have offered that member of Parliament some kind of incentive to do it. Like maybe it's the promise of a possible seat in cabinet, a ministerial posting. Those are very coveted by any MP because it's a big raise in salary. I think it's about over $100,000 more you get as a representative. Plus, you get a lot more prominence. You get a car and driver. You have a larger staff, and you're on television much more often than if you're just a regular backbench MP. So those are things that the party can offer to lure people to cross the floor. And in fact, they can also offer things like committee chairmanships and stuff like that that are less tangible benefits. So I mean, that is always the reaction from the party that has been dumped, is that they look for reasons why this person might have done it. I think we're ultimately going to have to hear a long form sit down interview with d'Entremont to find out exactly what was the thing, what was the final straw for him to make this decision.
Glen, I want to ask you what you make of the Canadian Conservative identity in 2025, and how a Canadian Conservative today differs from that under the Stephen Harper administration. What do you make of the differences there?
Yeah, there certainly has been an influence, I think, from the MAGA movement in the United States. And, until Donald Trump was elected the second time, I think there was a little more congruence between Canadian federal Conservatives and that part of the Republican Party in the United States. I mean, certainly there's lots of comparisons people have made between Donald Trump and Pierre Poilievre. And I think, on some stylistic levels, they do connect. There are some similarities in their approaches. not so much on the policy, but when Trump won the election last November and immediately started threatening tariffs against Canada, which he made good on the threats, then that put Poilievre in a really awkward situation. And the federal Conservatives really had this difficult balancing act where they had to keep the people within their tent who like Trump, and there are lots of Canadians. If you look at some of the public opinion polling right now, it shows that Trump is wildly unpopular in Canada, like in the 90% point if you take the country as a whole. But when you break it down by party that that poll respondent supports, about 50% of Canadian Conservatives still think Donald Trump is doing an okay job, according to some recent polling. So this is a kind of a tough balancing act for Conservatives to walk. I think maybe the more interesting thing now is whether or not, in this context, if there is a cleaving of the new Conservative Party in years to come. Because keeping in mind, the current version of this, the current iteration, only goes back to, I'm remembering by date here, 2004, when Stephen Harper and Peter MacKay united the Reform movement, what had been since renamed Canadian Alliance, with the existing progressive conservative movement. And that was supposed to be kind of a marriage of equals. Harper ultimately became the leader of that party. And I think a lot of people who came from the PC style still to this day don't feel totally comfortable with where the party is. I think maybe it's gone too far towards its roots in the Reform or more populist movement. So will this now situation with Carney being relatively popular, winning that the election, and the polls showing not a whole lot of change in that in the time since the election, I wonder if there's going to be sort of a reckoning amongst Conservatives whether or not they need to change direction, move it back a little more to the progressive conservative roots and away from sort of the Reform populism of Preston Manning and some of the forerunners who kind of built up that side of the party.
Glenn, I want to leave it on this note. Prime Minister Carney, he's leaning into a more center of right leadership style rather than that left leaning one compared to Justin Trudeau. Do you think Carney is doing a good job of seducing some of those red Tories across the country?
Yeah, clearly. I mean, that's why he won the election. I mean, he is governing right now like kind of a classic progressive conservative point of view. He's dispensed with a lot of the things that really eventually irritated people about Justin Trudeau. They may have liked it at the start. Remember, don't forget that day when Justin Trudeau walked up to meet the Governor General at Rideau Hall after having won the election in 2015. And talking about how he was going to have a gender-balanced cabinet. That was a really important thing for a lot of people at that time. It made headlines around the world. And since a lot of his progressive policies, some of the carbon tax, other policies that some people claim are woke, there isn't really as much appetite for that right now. And Carney is kind of dispensed with that. It's kind of interesting because Carney, prior to his recent entry in federal politics, was known as a very strong environmentalist. This does not seem to be a huge priority for him. You look at the budget that came out this week, it's not, by no means is a green budget in the way that some of those released by Justin Trudeau previously had been. So Carney is capturing, I think, some of those people, bringing them over. And that's why this is presenting such a challenge, I think, to Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives right now, because they used to count those people as part of their tent. And now they've lost them. A lot of them are moving out. Now, the Conservatives have been successful in some replacing the numbers by bringing over disaffected New Democrats, particularly from the working class. The traditional support for the NDP used to be big labor unions. That has really been eroded, and the Conservatives have been very good at bringing those people into their tent. Enough of them to make up for the potential losses of more traditional PC voters. Maybe not. But this can change. This is all very fluid. People move around back and forth all the time. I think we're going to get a better idea of where things are headed now once we get the Carney government has more time in power, and Canadians have more time to become tired of the Carney government. And then we're going to get to the point next year when Poilievre will have been through this leadership review, and we'll get a better sense of which way he wants to take the party, if he wants to take it in a different direction at all. I mean, Poilievre, personally, I don't think of him as being kind of an extreme right-wing person on policy stuff. I think it's more matters of style, and that's the thing that's gotten him into trouble. possibly got him into trouble here, in this case with Chris d'Entremont, and we'll see throughout the week whether or not there are others who also feel the same way.
All right, it'll be an interesting few weeks and few months to come. Glen McGregor, political correspondent for City News, thanks so much for breaking it all down for us.
Thanks, man.
And that was The Big Story. We'd love to hear what you thought of this episode. Reach us on X at The Big Story FPN, or send us an email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. New episodes of The Big Story come out every morning, Monday through Friday, and don't forget to catch our weekend listens. You can find us on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Maria Kestane. Thanks for listening.